Hi guys, with this video and the next we're going to talk about the presidency of Richard Nixon. You should have a graphic organizer that came with this video. In the center it says, Problems Nixon Faced During His First Term. Then there are some lines connecting that theme with 5 different areas. Be ready to fill in the numbered lines as you watch the video. Along the way, you're going to see the headings on your sheet pop up in the video, followed by the facts that you're going to write on the lines. You may need to pause the video at times to help you keep up, but it shouldn't be too much trouble for you. The first heading you're going to see in the video is welfare system, which is the one at the top center on your sheet. So if you want to be ready to hit that section with your facts, we're going to go ahead and get started. After his election as president in November of 1968, Richard M. Nixon picked Henry Kissinger to be his national security advisor. Kissinger was a professor at Harvard University and a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany. He had become a well-known foreign policy expert. Nixon felt that Kissinger had great intelligence, insight, and experience. Nixon also found that he and Kissinger had very similar ideas about politics. Both men were practical politicians who did not let their ideologies or beliefs get in the way of their actions. As president, Richard M. Nixon would have liked to focus on foreign policy and leave domestic issues to his cabinet, but he became president at a time when America was being torn apart by inflation, or a rise in prices across the economy, racial problems, and conflict over the war in Vietnam. Also, he had won the presidency in 1968 by only a narrow margin. His major support came from conservatives. They wanted him to shrink the federal government and end Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. Nixon hoped to cut the cost of running the federal government and turn some of its activities over to the states. But both houses of Congress were controlled by the Democrats. As a result, he took a more moderate approach at first. But he did veto many spending bills passed by the Democratic Congress. Included were cuts in funds for education and low-income housing, Great Society programs. In 1969, President Nixon attempted to change the existing welfare system, which had been criticized by conservatives, but he could not get congressional agreement. He was once more successful in starting revenue sharing. Under revenue sharing, the federal government gave back some tax money it collected to state and local governments. These governments could spend the money on any number of different programs. The plan was supported by both parties and passed Congress in 1972. During the presidential campaign, Nixon had said that he would restore law and order. He promised an end to social unrest and rioting of the late 1960s. Nixon also promised a return to traditional values. One way to his goal, Nixon thought, was to appoint more conservative justices to the Supreme Court. He believed that these justices would rule against those interpretations of the law. Such interpretations Nixon and his supporters felt were partly to blame for rising crime. During his first term, he appointed 4 new justices. Nixon also used all the powers of the federal government to crack down on crime and protest. He directed the Central Intelligence Agency and the Federal Bureau of Investigation to investigate some of his political enemies. Nixon would later excuse any illegal actions by claiming they were needed for the nation's security. Civil unrest and crime were not the only problems President Nixon had to face. He inherited serious economic troubles. Under the Johnson administration, the government began spending huge amounts of money on programs to aid the poor and on fighting the Vietnam War. But taxes were not raised to cover these expenses. As a result, the government spent more money than it collected in taxes. This practice is called deficit spending. Deficit spending put a great deal of money into circulation in the late 1960s. At the same time, the economy began to slow down. By 1970, the economy had gone into recession. With the recession, fewer goods were produced. The increase in the money supply and the decrease in products to buy caused inflation. Once again, inflation is a rise in prices across the economy. Inflation caused problems for all Americans, but especially the poor. One mother said, "I used to be able to go to the store with $50 and come back with 6 or 7 bags of groceries. Now I'm lucky if I come back with 3. When Nixon took office in 1969, the inflation rate was about 5%. That was twice the rate it had been earlier in the decade. Increasing unemployment was another problem. It doubled from about 3% in 1969 to 6% in 1971. Nixon tried different ways to help the economy. He cut spending. He also placed a temporary freeze on wage and price increases. Inflation dropped, but only temporarily. Then, in 1973, the economy was jolted by the actions of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. OPEC raised its prices and cut its shipments of oil to the United States. OPEC, which was made up mainly of Arab nations, took these actions in part to protest America's support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War of 1973. That war was fought between Israel and its Arab neighbors. In a few months, gas prices quadrupled. Inflation and unemployment soared to new heights. Besides these serious economic problems at home, Nixon also faced tough challenges in foreign policy. Nixon's main foreign policy goal was world stability. During his 1968 presidential campaign, Nixon pledged to end the Vietnam War quickly and honorably. It took 4 years to negotiate a ceasefire with the North Vietnamese. Nixon's most important triumph came in dealings with the People's Republic of China. He had long opposed the communists who took power in China in 1949. But Nixon believed a nation of 1 billion people could not be ignored. He asked Henry Kissinger to find a way to improve relations with China, even though they knew many Americans would be opposed. Kissinger arranged for Nixon to visit China in February 1972. This trip led to the opening of diplomacy and trade with Chinese. Nixon's China trip affected American relations with the Soviet Union, which was having conflicts with China. The Soviets feared closer relations between the United States and China, so they invited Nixon to Moscow in May 1972. As a result, Soviet-American relations improved. This easing of tensions between rivals is called détente, a French word. The policy of détente led the two nations to sign the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty of 1972, or SALT. This pact limited the number of each country's nuclear weapons, easing fears of nuclear war. Nixon's triumphs in foreign policy helped make him look like a sure winner for re-election in 1972. But as we will see, events that occurred in that campaign eventually destroyed his presidency.